Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so I got confused a bit because I was following initial instructions. So this room is for session B, Reflections on Social Justice, Social Protection for Marginalized Groups. The next room is Review of COVID-19 Social Protection National Responses. So session B remains here, session A moves to the next. This is for the physical participants. For the virtual participants, it should be pretty much easy for you to join the preferred session. Thank you.
So you can carry on. Good afternoon. May I ask Ms. Stacy Jacobs, Mr. Miselo Bwalia, Dr. Edmos Mtaitwa, Professor Daniel Tavera to come forward, please. Thank you. We need a chair. We need an extra chair. Okay, so we can start. We've got an hour, and my timekeeper, please keep your eyes on the timekeeper. And this parallel session will be looking at social justice, social protection for marginalized groups. And my first speaker is Ms. Stacy Jacobs from South Africa. Stacy Jacobs is a social justice activist, currently employed as a researcher at the Western Cape Office of Equal Education. She has previously worked in policy and research in the provincial government of the Western Cape, where she focused on the oversight of police and policing needs and priorities in the province. Her research interests include education, safety, and violence. And Stacy, okay.
So those that want to watch your session should go to session it's the opposite, and we'll set it up online.
Okay, so this is for the people watching the sessions online, that they've actually, it's the opposite. Those who want to watch this particular session must go to A, and the ones who want to watch review of COVID-19 social protection national responses must go to B. So that's for the online viewers. So Stacy Jacobs will be looking at the struggle for the justice of eating, the role of school feeding in promoting quality and equal schooling in South Africa.
Thank you. Hi. Hi, everyone. I am from Equal Education, and just to give a brief background on the movement, Equal Education is a mass-based democratic social movement of high school learners that we call equalizers, parents, community members, and teachers who advocate for quality and equality in the basic education system in South Africa. The campaigns that we take forward at Equal Education are informed by our members' experiences on the ground. And as I've said, Our members are largely made up of high school learners in South Africa who are able to bring their lived experiences to inform our campaigns and inform the demands that we make of government and other stakeholders, and we supplement this with research and policy analysis. Just waiting for my slides. So equal education is based in 5 provinces in South Africa, currently in Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and the Western Cape, where we organize thousands of members. So in this, I'll just continue with a bit of the outline then, while we're waiting for the presentation to come up. But in this session, I'll touch on the extent of hunger globally and nationally. I'll touch on the extent of food insecurity and hunger, both globally and nationally in South Africa. And then, given this context, I'll focus on the importance and impact of South Africa's National School Nutrition Program, which is a school feeding scheme led by government in the country, and it caters to over 9 million learners, or over 9 million vulnerable learners across 20,000 no-fee public schools in South Africa. Okay. Sure. It's. Can I have a moment?
Okay.
Okay, excuse me, I'll just pull up my presentation. So, as I've said in this presentation, I'll touch on the extent of food insecurity and hunger, both globally and in South Africa. And I'll speak on the importance of the National School Nutrition Program as a government social protection measure, and further elaborate on why its suspension amid the COVID-19 lockdown and the closure of schools had far-reaching consequences for the most vulnerable children of South Africa. And so just to move on to hunger and food insecurity. So, although recognized as a human right, the right to food and the pursuit and achievement of SDG 2, which envisions zero hunger by 2030, remains elusive for many. Research that has shown that as at 2017, approximately 1.9 billion people worldwide were moderately or severely food insecure. This meant that approximately 1 in 4 had little or inadequate access to safe, nutritionally balanced food to enable an active and healthy lifestyle, and children are particularly vulnerable to these ills. In the South African context alone, available data shows that hunger continues to persist, with approximately 1.7 million households experiencing hunger and inadequate food access. In that same year, more than 500,000 households with children aged 5 or younger experienced hunger. The pandemic exacerbated this crisis. So the national income dynamic study, the coronavirus rapid mobile survey, showed that the prevalence of household food insecurity and hunger drastically increased in South Africa with the onset of the pandemic and has remained relatively high since June 2020. Between May and June 2020, 21% of adults had reported that someone in the household went hungry in the last 7 days. So I'm now going to speak about the National School Nutrition Program as a social protection measure that complements other child support interventions in South Africa, such as the Child Support Grant, which was touched on by a speaker earlier today. So the NSNP is a government program that provides a nutritious meal to over 9 million school-going learners in South Africa every day of the academic term. These learners are primarily from no-fee public schools, and the NSNP also caters to a number of vulnerable children in fee-paying public schools in South Africa. And the aim of the NSNP is to reduce the effects of hunger and malnutrition on these learners' ability to learn. So the Department of Basic Education itself has acknowledged that the NSNP has shown to improve punctuality and has promoted regular school attendance, concentration, as well as promoted the health of learners in South Africa. Even prior to COVID-19, the National School Nutrition Program was an essential safety net for these learners. For many of them, it's their only guaranteed meal of the day. So it was absolutely bizarre when in March 2020, amid school closures and COVID-19, the Basic Education Minister announced a suspension of the National School Nutrition Program. And this denied millions of learners who rely on it access to this vital food support. So I want to read this quote that a parent member of Equal Education had told us when she reflected on the impact or the value of the NSNP in her home. She noted that her child is struggling a lot because as a family, we only eat once a day. We are dependent on the school meals or food parcels since there is no one who is working in the family. And this is but one example of the huge impact of the program's suspension. So, it became increasingly important for civil society organizations to call on government and implore government to reinstate the National School Nutrition Program. It was urgent. We did this through a number of ways. We had written open letters to the National Department of Basic Education. We'd engaged with them in formal meetings, as well as we engaged with them in formal meetings, as well as through civil society networks that they had set up during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also intensified our media advocacy around this. In May, when the Council of Education Ministers met, and the Council of Education Ministers just brings together the ministers of all provincial education departments in South Africa, and they decided to reopen the NSNP for all schools, for all learners once schools had reopened. So this would mean learners who were studying on rotation, as well as learners who were attending physically at the time, or were fully attending school at the time. However, in a media briefing, just before learners were expected to return to school, the Basic Education Minister, Andrew Motshekga, backtracked on this commitment, saying that the sector only had capability or only had the ability to feed those learners who had returned full-time to school. So at the time, that was grade 7 and 12s. It is in this context that Equal Education and the school governing bodies of 2 Limpopo schools urgently launched an application in the North Gauteng High Court. We took the National Department of Basic Education and 8 provincial education departments to court, calling for the reinstatement and the immediate reinstatement of the NSNP. Eventually, we secured a landmark victory in July of 2020 when the court handed down a declaratory order confirming that education departments were in breach of their constitutional duties, and a supervisory interdict requiring education departments to file plans for the immediate reinstatement of the program and progress reports thereafter. Okay. So it was very important as a civil society organization, and after having secured this victory, to monitor the rollout of the NSNP. And there were two important with the minister and provincial education ministers on the receiving from them. And secondly, we were intent on surveying members of Equal Education, so learner members and parent members, teachers and other school officials, to understand whether learners were really accessing their meals, and if what we were seeing in government reports were translating on the ground. And I think I'll just add here that in terms of the surveys that we conducted, we were somewhat constrained by access due to COVID-19 to some of our members. So while our survey samples were relatively small, the story behind what we found from these surveys were compelling enough and confirmed the issues that were being brought up in that were being highlighted in government's progress reports. So the government, when they filed their first set of progress reports after the reinstatement of the NSNP as per the court order, they had noted or identified a number of problems with the uptake of the NSNP. And this included that parents were reluctant to let their children go to school because of the risk of COVID-19, as well as the long distances between the home and their schools to be able to access these meals that were being provided on days that they were rotating. And, you know, another big issue that we saw on the ground was that communication between between provincial education departments, districts, and with people who qualified for the NSNP were unable to get communication, letting them know that the meals were available. So this is where we had also started again to speak to our equalizers, or our high school learner members. And just to give you some statistics, so of those learners, and this was a survey conducted in September 2020, of those learners who were on rotation, we had surveyed 125. Nearly 3/4 of them did not access meals on the days that they were not at school. And some of the challenges that affected their ability to access these meals included, as identified in the government progress reports, lack of scholar transport. And we must also remember that in order for learners to be able to access, to be able to go to their schools to access their meals without the provision of scholar transport would be an additional financial burden on these already vulnerable families. And then in September, when we asked the same question, in October, when we had surveyed a further 192 learners, of those learners who were rotating, 93% had said that they were not accessing meals on the days that they were not at school. And then, you know, it just started, these challenges intensified, they persisted despite this right to, or despite the court order and these learners' rights to a school meal. So in March 2021, the DBE had reported that over 3 million learners were still not accessing the NSNP. That is a third, or practically a third, of those learners who had qualified. And then we conducted another monitoring survey of 300 learners in March 2021, which corroborated the DBE's reports. Again, it was the same types of issues. So not having scholar transport to access their meals, not knowing that the meals were available on days that they were able to, on days that they were learning from home, and also that learners were unable to access the schools nearest to them to be able to collect meals there. We also interviewed parents, principals, and other school officials on whether or not, thank you, on whether or not learners were accessing their meals. And principals and school officials told us that, they had just said that they had tried to get hold of government or tried to engage government on the fact that there was a lack of scholar transport, on the fact that learners did not have the finances available to be able to access their meals by using other forms of transport. And in terms of what parents had told us, they reflected on how, the suspension of the National School Nutrition Program had not only affected their learners, so their children who were unable to focus on an empty stomach, who were unable to study when they were hungry, or who were not physically active because of not being able to access these meals. And it also affected parents in the sense that there were mental and emotional impacts of the suspension of this program. Many of them told us that they felt depressed having to see their learners not being able to access food and feeling the burden of not being able to provide for their children, even though this was through no fault of their own. Some parents had also told us that their learners had to use the study time on days that they were at home to be able to look for part-time work so they could help support the families. So it was in this context then that we returned to court last year because not all learners were being fed in terms of the NSNP, despite the 2020 court order requiring government to do so. We eventually reached a settlement agreement, which became an order of court. And since that agreement was reached, 95% of eligible learners were reported having being fed during the period in August 2021. That was the month directly after the settlement agreement. And then I would just like to take us through a couple of recommendations that Equal Education has made, given what we saw with the suspension of the NSNP. And we've noted that government should prioritize the NSNP through adequate funding and appropriate support to ensure continuous meal provision through schools, regardless of shocks to the system, of shocks to the sector. We've also noted that the DBE should develop and introduce clear, coherent, and adaptable plans and strategies that will be responsive to potential future disruptions to the sector. We also said that it is absolutely important that the DBE coordinates its efforts with other departments to ensure that measures introduced will alleviate hunger and fully reach their intended targets. Lastly, we've noted the need for more rigorous and coordinated research to fully understand the impact of the NSNP on key developmental indicators in children. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Bwalia from Zambia. Ms. is a trained economist and researcher working as a researcher at the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. He possesses over 7 years' experience conducting economic and public policy analysis. He holds a Master's of Arts degree in economic and a Bachelor's of Arts in economics from the University of Zambia. As a policy analyst, Ms. has served on various technical committees that have led to the development and review of key policies in Zambia. Ms. served as a member of the Technical Committee to review the 7th National Development Plan, a member of the technical committee that developed Zambia's first voluntary national reviews for the Sustainable Development Goals, and a member of the technical committee of Cash Plus, a variation to Zambia's largest social protection programs, the social cash transfer. And Ms. Olowale will be talking about the distributional effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in Zambia. Ms. Olo. And please, let's keep to time. Okay.
Thank you so much, Chair. So to start, our presentation is basically titled The Distributional Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic in Zambia. What we tried to do with this study was basically to try to quantify the impact of government action in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically in our study, we look at what the impact was of the actions that government as well as coordinating partners had done in terms of intervening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so to do this analysis, we had basically used what is known as a micro ZAMOD. So it's a micro simulation model that we use to help us assess the impact of micro benefits or micro simulation benefits. And so this system is basically what we used to try to estimate, and this is what our study used, and the findings that will be presented here are based on this model that was jointly developed by our institution, the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, and the UNU WIDER, which is the United Nations University. Okay, so I think Doc earlier in the morning had talked about Zambia's economic situation in terms of growth. On the next slide, please. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Zambia's economic growth was already sustained or under pressure. Around 2018, Zambia was only growing at 4%. 2019 was at 1.4%. And by the time we got to 2020, the economy had contracted by 2.8%. And so we had quite a number of key industries going down during that period. These included retail, education, public administration, construction, accommodation, obviously tourism, and other sectors, while we only had very few sectors actually performing or sustaining growth. These were mainly agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, and ICT. We also looked at some of the interventions that government had put through, or some of the containment measures, should I put it this way. So some of the containment measures, and these affected generally the performance of the economy, were obviously, this included the closure of schools. My colleague who just made her presentation was talking about the school feeding program. Zambia also has a school feeding program that caters to about 3 million pupils. And this program is basically provided in school. And so when you close the schools, this program is also suspended. So during that period, during the suspension of the closure of schools, that program was also affected. Other programs, of course, or other interventions that the government had put in place were restriction of movements. I think these were also done in other countries, restriction to travel, mandatory quarantine. And so these also had their own effects on the economic activity. People could not move out, especially those that are most vulnerable, those that depend on day-to-day sales, those that are working in the informal sector, in markets that are selling. All those had their livelihoods impacted. We also had temporary lockdown of certain towns. So certain towns were locked down. People could not move. We also had partial closure of borders. One of the largest employers in Zambia in terms of the sector is the wholesale and trade, where people rely on trading, cross-border trading, bringing in goods that they then resell in markets. And so the closure of the borders also affected this particular sector, which caters for those in the formal sector, but also largely those that are in the informal sector. And so these containment measures, to a certain extent, actually had a negative impact on the lives of many Zambians, especially the vulnerable. And so I think I'll skip this slide already. Just looks at, of course, what we estimated in terms of the shock. So as a result of those measures and what the economy looked like in terms of the shock, you had quite a number of industries being affected. We estimated that arts, entertainment, recreation, public administration, accommodation, food, where you expect your tourism to occur. We had quite a number of places like hotels shut down. These were the sectors that were heavily affected. Education also, like I mentioned, was closed. We also had wholesale and retail also closed in terms of, or negatively affected. So you had these sectors sort of contracting, and those that we estimated to have at least had some positive impact in terms of GDP were areas like mining, quarry, real estate, transportation to a certain extent, and then you also had professional and scientific and technical services. These are mostly colleagues in the formal spaces. Most of us were able to shift from the offices and work from home, and so not really as heavily affected by the impact. And so this also, and these results are also produced from our model. Now, we look at the socioeconomic responses on the next slide. I think my colleague from Zambia had also alluded to this. The government basically introduced what was known as a COVID-19 emergency cash transfer. This program was run for 6 months. And like my colleague had mentioned, the program basically had two types of expansion. There was the vertical and the horizontal. So one meaning they had added to those that were already receiving the cash transfer. It's one of the largest social protection programs in Zambia. Currently covers 1 million households. So not people, but 1 million households receive, because it's provided per household. So you had 1 million households receiving this. And this emergency cash transfer was basically provided in a manner that it was supplementing those that were already benefiting, but then also identified new beneficiaries. So those that were not previously covered under this particular program. I think earlier it was also alluded to that though the funding came from cooperating partners, it was administered through the government, and initially 22 districts. Zambia has 116 districts, so gives you an idea of how many were covered. So 22 districts were provided with monthly transfers of 400 kwacha, and the coverage was 200,000 households. Now, for context, the cash transfer at the time in Zambia provides 90 kwacha per household. So under the normal system, households would receive a 90 kwacha. But during this time, they were receiving more than 4 times what was provided. So this also just showed the sort of estimation in terms of how much support was required at household level. And I think in earlier discussions, it was also mentioned that part of improving the social protection system must be looking at providing an amount that is useful, sustainable to the households. For context, the 90 kwacha provided at the time was around $5. And I think this 400 kwacha, I think my colleague had provided where he had converted is around $23. So that's sort of what was provided. And this is given per month to the households. So this is supposed to sustain the households for the month. And for households where there are disabilities or you have a member with a disability, you are given twice this particular amount. So meaning, meaning under the normal system at the time in 2020, the households would receive 180 kwacha, and under this program, they'll receive double this amount. So again, like I mentioned, in terms of assessing this particular impact, we relied on the micro simulation model, which is basically known as the micro ZAMOD, which allows us to understand the tax and benefits that go to a particular household. Of course, in terms of the technicalities, it's underpinned by the Living Conditions Monitoring Survey, which basically tries to capture the structure of households. And this model allows us to evaluate the current situation as well as also simulate potential policy reforms. So meaning when you have an introduction like the emergency cash transfer, we're able to model this or include this in our model, and it helps us to understand what the potential impact is on the households. And so in terms of some of the things that we're able to also model, apart from the emergency cash transfer, was basically posing that homegrown school feeding program, which I talked about, due to the school closures. As we know, this is also a benefit that goes to the households. I think my colleague had talked about the importance of these meals. A lot of children are drawn to school basically to try to benefit from these meals. And in Zambia, I think schools were closed for quite a long period. I think must have been about 6 months. And so meaning for this period that schools were closed, a lot of children, especially those coming from vulnerable households, were not able to benefit from this particular intervention. And so we tried to model all these into our program to get the results. Now, what it basically showed us, on the next slide, we have a table that shows us our results. And what we did was, previously we had the poverty rates where you don't have COVID. Before COVID, what did the poverty rates look like? What did the poverty gap look like? And then we now introduced these particular models. And so from our estimations, I'm sorry, the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what the results showed for us was that poverty headcount worsened by 2% as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the poverty gap also increased by 2%. Okay, and so inequality measured by the Gini coefficient, obviously, as shown here, increased by 1% overall as a result of the pandemic. Now, while it increased by 2%, when we remove these particular interventions, it shows us that poverty headcount would have actually increased by 3% and not 2.2%. And the poverty gap would have also increased by 3.5% and not the 2%. This basically shows us that the interventions that were put in place during the pandemic actually helped to cushion that impact. So in terms of poverty headcount, it only increased by 2.2% instead of 3%, and the poverty gap only increased by 2% instead of 3.5%. And this sort of helped us to quantify or look at the measures. So of course, poverty worsened, but some of these measures had some impact in cushioning or reducing this particular impact. Now, like I said, in terms of our key findings, and this is just to summarize what we found on the next slide, basically shows us that the emergency cash transfer and other interventions by the government helped to stabilize incomes of the most vulnerable and offset some of the negative shock on poverty, despite both headcount poverty and the poverty gap worsening. Now, obviously, without this intervention, it shows that this effect might have been much worse. The other thing, obviously, was that the emergency cash transfer, which was this temporary intervention, was highly effective in cushioning incomes of the lower half of the income distribution. And then also, we look at the automatic response of the tax benefit policies to changes in income. This only cushioned the negative impact to a limited extent. When we talk about the automatic response of the tax benefit policies, we looked at the other policies that the government had basically put in place, and these were largely targeted at the formal sector. And so you see that they were not as effective because a large number of the population are in the informal sector. So a large number of the vulnerable are in the informal sector. So other policies that the government had put in place, there were some tax benefits that the government had put in place. The government had suspended some taxes in certain sectors of the economy. And these largely cushioned those that were in the formal sector. And so these didn't have a lot of impact for the vulnerable, but also shows the structure of the economy, that a large number of the vulnerable Zambians and Zambians are actually in the informal sector, where it was very difficult to reach them through this particular intervention. Lastly, when we come to the policy recommendations, one of the first things that we note is that obviously at the time of the intervention, the government was basically under the normal program, giving out the equivalent of 90 kwacha. But under the emergency cash transfer, that was also supported externally, they were basically providing 400 kwacha. So that already shows you that this program was able to identify that the current social protection system is not sufficient. Of course, this was in 2020. This is 2022 now. There have been some revisions to that amount. The government now provides 200 kwacha as opposed to 90 kwacha in 2020. But again, this is still far below what was being provided under that particular emergency cash transfer. And that basically shows us that there is still a gap that we need if we want to address or impact or provide better social protection. And then obviously the other issues, I think this was also brought in during the discussion, that there is need for high quality data to improve and understanding the impact of the tax benefit policies, especially during general times and during crisis times. You note that part of the challenge that we had doing this study was we're basically relying on a model that relied on 2015 survey. And this was the latest survey in terms of assessing poverty in the country. And so that shows that countries must also invest in bringing up-to-date surveys. So for example, in Zambia, 2015 is the latest measure for poverty. When people talk about poverty rates in Zambia, you're basically referring to 2015. And we know that since 2015, there have been a lot of changes that have impacted households. We talk about COVID-19. I think previously we had El Nino and climate change impacting on households. And so all those are not really covered in the structure. And so emphasis in terms of the policy recommendations was that there is need to invest in high quality data to help us. Yes, thank you. That's my last point. So basically, the two recommendations broadly that we put in is that there is need for governments to invest in high quality data that then we policy researchers, those that are policymakers can use to actually make sound decisions that help us to enhance our social protection systems. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Edmos Mtetwa. Dr. Edmos Mtetwa is a seasoned academic in the field of social work, social policy, and social protection, with particular interest in marginalized groups, such as persons with disabilities. Dr. Mtetwa has been a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Zimbabwe for the past 13 years and has authored more than 70 publications. He is Chief Director responsible for social development and disability affairs in government. Dr. Mtetwa is responsible for the whole social protection portfolio in Zimbabwe, including the development of policies and programs meant to ameliorate the lives of vulnerable key populations, groups such as persons with disabilities. Dr. Mtetwa will be talking about relieving social protection for persons with disabilities in the context of COVID-19 restrictive measures in Zimbabwe. Dr. Mtetwa.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to bring to the fore, just to reliving, the experiences of persons with disabilities within the context of restrictive measures, or containment measures brought forth, by COVID-19. It's common cause that the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, brought with it some, devastating effects, across, the globe. And but on the socioeconomic front, the pandemic, key milestones, as it were, was to exacerbate the already stark inequalities between, and among social classes. Um, Persons with disabilities, were in no way spared by the negative impact, of the restrictive or containment measures put in place by governments, in order to contain the spread of the pandemic. In a context where, social protection, programs and benefits fall short, of adequately sustaining beneficiaries throughout, a month, coupled with the high levels of unemployment, persons with disabilities, thrived mostly, on vending, and at times begging to augment their livelihoods. It is in this context that um, um, we discuss their plight and the judge cultural, attitudinal, institutional, and environmental factors characteristic of most developing, societies, including Zimbabwe. Persons with disabilities have more often been found to be overrepresented, on those, likely not to be employed and living, largely on the fringes, so to say, of the formal economy. It is from this kind of state of affairs that persons with disabilities, like I indicated beforehand, found as beggars and the street vendors, trying to eke a living through what I may conveniently call invisible means. In a situation where, streets are cleared, you know, in situations where, you know, people are literally locked down, and not allowed to go about their normal duties. Uh, Street vending comes to, an abrupt halt, and leaving, the patrons, out of business. By way of methodology, I may not want to take much of your time. On it suffice to say, this paper is a product, of a qualitative, study of, conducted by myself, just as some kind of a rapid, study, but in exploratory in nature, in order to gather the felt needs, of such a social group. So I may not really take your time on this. Let me hasten to next slide on findings. We discuss, these findings, including the findings that were augmented, by available literature, on national policies. And just for, uh, needless to emphasize, rather, this the context is the 2020 to 2021, but emphasis shall, as it now, be given to the 2020 because it was that during that time that the panic buttons were pressed by everybody, around the globe. And the key among our policies was, the 2020 mid-term supplementary budget statement that sought to plug fiscal gaps created, by largely, an anticipated COVID-19, pandemic. Um, the national midterm supplementary budget, statement. Thank you. You know, gave us vulnerable people um, about 50 million Zimbabwean dollars, which in then was equivalent to plus or minus, I think 30 or so million US dollars. Um, to support, the lives and livelihoods of the transitory poor. Now, the extent to which this amount was channeled towards, the lockdown-induced vulnerabilities of persons with disabilities remains, blurred. Yeah, and the process of the the problem, that was incurred was came out of the process of registration and identification of persons with disabilities, in Zimbabwe, because that remains an underdeveloped area. And this is so despite the fact that we have an elaborate legislative framework that um, encourages and empowers the Department of Disability Affairs to collect statistics on persons with disabilities. And on the wake of the pandemic, the government of Zimbabwe did not just sit on its laurels or sit back and watch events unfolding. Rather, no problem. Rather, it developed some, social protection interventions to mitigate against, the extreme poverty induced by, distributing SIM cards in order to facilitate electronic mobile money transfers. The issue is these were not felt or by persons with disabilities themselves, who in a number of cases said they received nothing from that process. And even the organizations of persons with disabilities, what you call OPDs, did try to intervene in their own way, but their intervention in the wake of subdued financial resources from donors did not go far. In the final analysis, sorry, Madam Chair, um, let me give a few recommendations that are meant to, ameliorate the lives of persons with disabilities. We recommend that there is need to ensure the issue of meaningful consultation with and active participation, of persons with disabilities, and their representative, organizations, at all, levels or phases, of COVID-19 and other calamities, response and recovery, strategies in sync with Section 22 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. About the lack of participation showed, it revealed itself in the way responses, were put across. The on that note, it is worth my emphasis that many persons with disabilities have got experiences of thriving in situations, of isolation and, alternate working arrangements that could do even provide, the models, for navigating, the situation. And these perspectives and lived experiences, of disability, the potential to contribute towards, the creation of new ideas and alternatives. In the final analysis, um, um, may I also just say that the governments, donors, UN agencies, and other actors needed to establish, mechanisms to monitor, investments to ensure, that it is reaching persons with disabilities. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Due to the overrunning, we'll probably have to ask that if you have any questions, you just write them or try to engage the speakers over lunch. We may not have a question and answer session. Our last speaker is Professor Daniel Tavera. Professor Daniel Tavera has a PhD degree in human geography from the University of Cincinnati, USA, and is an extraordinary professor in the Department of Geography, Environmental Studies, and Tourism at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. His research focuses on food and the city, livelihoods and resilience, and African migration. He has published extensively on migration, urban food systems. Professor Tavera talks about COVID-19 and migrant struggles to access social protection in South Africa. Professor, you only have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My late grandfather once said, young man, if you happen to have the misfortune of presenting just before lunch, try to make it short. I'll try to follow his advice. The title of my presentation is COVID-19 and Migrant Struggles to Access Social Protection in South Africa. Next slide, please. My presentation is structured as follows. There is going to be a background, objectives, research questions, methodology, findings, and some conclusions. Next slide, please. The literature on migrants and social protection highlights three very relevant issues. In sub-Saharan Africa, international migrants are generally a vulnerable group with little access to social protection. Worth noting is that recent debate on the African migrant question has focused on migrant precarity and the role of social protection in cushioning migrant vulnerability. Unfortunately, and quite disturbing, is that across sub-Saharan Africa, migrants have become convenient scapegoats for national societal problems such as unemployment, poverty, and pandemics. These points reinforce the need for SASPEN to continue engaging society on social protection issues on the continent. Next slide, please. So what are the objectives and research questions? I have two objectives. First, to examine the challenges facing asylum seekers and special permit holders in South Africa during the COVID-19 lockdown. Second, to make us think about whether social protection programs in South Africa are contributing to the reduction of migrant household vulnerability and precarity. The research question asked is, what is the connection between social protection exclusion and COVID-19 infection, poverty, and household food insecurity? Next slide, please. This shows the study area we are talking about an African problem, so that we have Africa. It also shows the whole of South Africa. But my work mainly focuses on what's happening in the Cape Town area. Next slide, please. The methodology is based on a desktop study that followed a three-step methodological process that is displayed before. We're going to be in the field. We've applied for ethical clearance certificate. Because of the nature of the study, it has taken a little long to be available, but we know we'll get it. The methodology for the desk study was a three-step process. First, there was a desktop search for peer-reviewed articles on organization reports. This involved, browsing, Scopus, using keywords, migrants, social protection, and Cape Town. The second step was also continuation of desktop research for peer-reviewed articles and various reports. And the third stage involved having a snowball technique that involved checking the list of references for additional literature from the documents we had collected. Next slide, please. Going to the findings. Economic distress caused by COVID-19 lockdowns and economic decline has adversely affected many migrant groups. The literature points to that. And this has compounded the challenges facing migrants. Most migrants operating in the informal sector are not covered by social protection benefits. The requirements for migrants to access relief packages are stringent, and most of the migrants are unable to meet these conditions. For example, they need to have all their papers. Everything has to be up to date. So usually it doesn't happen that way. This situation has contributed to the social unrest in many South African cities, including some of the examples from Cape Town below. In other words, these frustrations with migrants not getting what they want, and then also the residents feeling that migrants are contributing to the problem. So that has created some kind of a challenge. There've been a number of visuals, whether in newspapers or on TV, showing some of these struggles. For example, this one shows that at the height of some of the protests that took place, particularly in Cape Town, but also in the other large cities of South Africa, police and refugees clashed. For example, in the Cape Town city center, where the refugees had camped outside the UN High Commission for Refugees office before occupying the Central Methodist Church. Next slide, please. That's another image, this time showing migrant women in a marquee in the Paint City shelter in Belleville. This was during COVID, when because of the lockdown procedures and so on, they had to be shifted. And of course, there was some resistance.
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. This slide, please, the next slide shows the triple crisis affecting migrants in South Africa. Policy responses should not simply focus on the triggers, for example, COVID-19, but on the deep-seated structural challenges or the crisis. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this slide shows the major crisis. There is the health crisis which needs to be addressed, especially during the COVID era. And for the migrants, that focus on unsanitary and crowded living conditions, compromised access to health services, and food insecurity due to lack of livelihoods. The other crisis related to socio-economic crisis, rising from unemployment, loss of livelihood, and the third, it was the social protection crisis, curtailed access to asylum, detention, forced returns, and deportation. So you ended up with stranded migrants, family separation, and so on. Okay, so just to summarize a number of issues, we find that the lockdowns negatively impacted migrant employment, migrant earnings, and migrant health. The three crises which I breezed through provide a compelling argument for extending social protection and sickness benefits to migrants residing in refugee camps and informal settlements. Clearly say with the health crisis, unless the issues of sanitation and so on are addressed, the problem is going to continue. The COVID-19 pandemic has eliminated the gaps in social health protection. Giving social protection to the informal sector is not only about assisting migrants. In many ways, it is also about providing coherence to the informal sector as a whole. And it is important to note that by ensuring social protection of migrants, society at large is safeguarding itself given the various existential threats to humans presented by various pandemics, COVID-19 being just one of them. Next slide, please. So to conclude, the three main takeaways from my presentation are as follows. For asylum seekers and refugees, I've singled out on this because we know there are different types of migrant groups, but this is the group that is quite visible in Cape Town, and this is a group which has been experiencing a lot of some of these challenges. Okay, these two vulnerable groups have not benefited from social protection programs because of several structural and program management related challenges. The government and its social partners need to continue working on how to make the available social protection programs more inclusive across residential status, gender, and economic sectors. Migrants need to be included in government social protection programs. Next slide, please. So, Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We come to the end of this parallel session, dubbed Reflections on Social Justice, Social Protection for Marginalized Groups. As we said, we've run out of time, so we are not going to have the question and answer session, but I'll ask that we take advantage of the lunch session to engage the different presenters and get clarity on any issue that would want clarity on. On this note, I'd like to close and thank the presenters. Thank you so much.